Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. I didn't realize right away that it was a mistake. At that moment, everything felt so thrilling, forbidden, and utterly irresistible. But looking back, I understand that it was the first crack in the fragile shell I had been building for years. Perhaps you've already guessed what I'm talking about. But even if you think you know how this will end, I assure you that surprises await. After all, I couldn't have imagined how it would all turn out myself. My name is Meredith, and this story begins in our cozy home on the outskirts of a small town, where life flowed predictably and steadily. I had a family that many would call ideal. A caring husband, a beautiful home, and a son whose future seemed bright and secure. But one day, everything changed. Blake entered our lives. He was my husband's nephew, but the way he looked at me that first evening made me feel something I hadn't experienced in a long time. And so, my story began with that look. But believe me, this is just the beginning. I was standing by the kitchen sink, polishing the last glass, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. It was Louis, my husband. He was coming home after a long day at work. As usual, he was exhausted, and as soon as he crossed the threshold, he headed straight for the refrigerator in search of something refreshing. His hair, once thick and full, now had hints of gray at the temples, and his face looked worn from years of hard work. "Hi, honey," he said with a smile, but the spark that used to be in his eyes was no longer there. "Hi, Louis," I replied, hanging the glass on the drying rack. We exchanged a brief glance, and I quickly returned to my thoughts. Over dinner, he told me about his plans for the weekend. Louis's nephew, Blake, was going to stay with us for a few days. Blake was the son of Louis's younger brother, and although they didn't see each other often, they had always shared a strong bond. I remembered him as a teenager, tall, gangly, with an awkward smile. But many years had passed, and now he was in his 20s. I simply nodded in response, trying to suppress the growing unease that was building inside me. The next day, as planned, Blake arrived. The first time I saw him, he was getting out of his car, heading toward the house with a suitcase in hand. It was immediately clear that he had changed. His entire demeanor radiated confidence. He was taller and broader than I remembered, and his hair was neatly trimmed. He smiled at me as he approached the door, and suddenly, I felt a warmth spread across my cheeks. "Hi, Meredith, you look great," he said, giving me a firm hug. At that moment, I felt his hand linger on my shoulder just a little longer than what would be appropriate for a casual greeting. My heart started to beat faster, and I looked away, feeling a bit uncomfortable. "Hi, Blake. Come in, make yourself at home," I replied, trying to sound calm, though inside I was a whirlwind of emotions. We entered the house, and I showed him to the guest room, trying not to look his way too often. Nevertheless, I couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on me, assessing my every move. Louis, as usual, was absorbed in his work, and Blake quickly found his place in our home. He was attentive to details, always helpful around the house, and eagerly spent time with us during dinner. But every time he was nearby, I felt a strange tension, as if the air around us became thick and heavy. It seemed like he noticed every gesture, every movement, and I began to sense that there was an invisible connection between us that I couldn't, and didn't want to, break. One of those evenings, we were sitting on the terrace, enjoying the warm evening breeze. Louis had gone to bed, and I was left alone with Blake. He lit a cigarette, and looking at me, asked, "Have you ever thought that life isn't just black and white?" "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling something stir deep inside me. Sometimes we see the world in such narrow terms that we miss the many other shades. There are times when desires and passions push us to do things we wouldn't dare speak of out loud, he said, exhaling a stream of smoke into the warm evening air. I froze, trying not to show that his words had touched me to the core. This was the first time I truly felt like I was on the brink of something big, dangerous, and thrilling all at once. That evening marked the beginning of something that would turn my life upside down. The next morning, when I woke up, thoughts of our conversation on the terrace still lingered in my mind. I tried to brush them off, convince myself that it was just an innocent exchange of words, but the feeling of something inevitable had already taken root inside me. Throughout the day, I found myself unconsciously looking for Blake, anticipating our next encounter, wanting to hear his voice. Louis was at work, and I was home alone. Blake was occupied with his tasks in the guest room, and the house was filled with a strange, oppressive silence. I tried to distract myself, focusing on cleaning, preparing lunch, but thoughts of him kept returning again and again. By evening, Blake suggested we go for a walk. His offer caught me off guard, but I quickly agreed, hoping that the fresh air and conversation would divert me from these unwelcome thoughts. We walked along the path that led to the woods behind the house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. Blake was at ease, his voice soft and calming, but I sensed that there was something more behind his calm demeanor. "You know, Meredith, I've always admired you," he suddenly said, interrupting our talk about everyday matters. "What exactly?" I asked, surprised, trying to hide the embarrassment in my voice. "You're an incredibly strong and beautiful woman. I realized that when I was a teenager. But now, seeing you again, everything feels more real, more tangible." His voice was sincere, and I felt my heart start to beat faster. I stopped, feeling how Blake's words awakened emotions in me that I had long buried. It was dangerous, but at the same time, impossible to resist. "Blake, this is wrong," I whispered, but I couldn't take my eyes off his face, off the deep gaze that held passion and desire. "Why? You've been hiding your feelings for so long. Why can't you allow yourself to be happy, even if that happiness is fleeting?" He stepped closer, his breath brushing against my skin. Inside me, two forces were battling. One screamed to stop, to run away before it was too late, while the other pulled me towards him, making me forget everything, consequences, morality. I knew this was wrong, but the passion was too strong. And then, in that moment, when the evening air became almost unbearably thick, Blake leaned in and, without waiting for an answer, gently kissed me. That kiss was like a flash of lightning. It illuminated everything around, filling me with energy I hadn't felt in years. His lips were soft, yet insistent, demanding. I couldn't resist this impulse. We stood there, on the edge of the woods, hidden from the world, and it seemed like time had stopped. My hands instinctively wrapped around his neck. I pressed against him, and for a moment, I allowed myself to forget reality, to forget that this moment was forbidden. When we pulled away from each other, his eyes were glowing with the same fire as before. But now there was an understanding in them. He knew that this kiss had changed everything. We both knew it. I tried to say something, to justify myself, but the words stuck in my throat. "Meredith," he began, but I interrupted him. "Please don't say anything now. I need time to process all this," I whispered, and breaking away from his embrace, quickly headed back to the house. I felt his gaze burning into my back, but I didn't look back. That night was long. Lewis returned home later than usual, and I did everything I could to act as I always did. But inside, I was in turmoil. Blake stayed in his room, and fortunately, we didn't cross paths. But I knew that the moment on the path to the woods was just the beginning. How could I have let this happen? Why couldn't I stop it? The answers to these questions would come, but for now, I was left alone with my thoughts and the memories of his lips, of how he made me feel alive. The next few days passed as if in a fog. I tried to keep myself composed, to pretend that everything was as it had always been, but inside, chaos reigned. Blake was attentive, but maintained a distance, as if understanding that I needed space to process what had happened. However, every time our eyes met, I felt the same spark that had ignited on that path. Lewis either didn't notice the changes, or perhaps just didn't want to. He was engrossed in his work, and our conversations increasingly became formal, devoid of any real emotional connection. This had suited me before, but now, after what had happened with Blake, I began to feel the emptiness in our relationship more acutely. One evening, when Lewis stayed late at work again, Blake suggested we drive into town to get some groceries. I agreed, hoping it would help me distract myself. We drove in silence, listening to music in the background, and despite my efforts to remain calm, the tension in the car grew with each passing minute. When we entered the supermarket, I felt his hand accidentally brush against mine, and that touch sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I pretended not to notice, but inside, everything was boiling. We gathered groceries, talking about trivial things, but our words were empty because both he and I were thinking about something else entirely. After shopping, Blake suggested we stop by a lookout point that offered a view of the entire city. I hesitated, knowing that this could lead to something I had been trying to avoid. But despite my inner protests, I nodded. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, bathing the city below in golden light. We stood side by side, taking in the view, and I felt my heart begin to race. Blake, without saying a word, turned to me and looked directly into my eyes. In his gaze, there was a mix of passion and determination. "Meredith, you know how I feel about you," he said quietly, but with certainty. I sighed, trying to hold back what seemed inevitable. "Blake, this is wrong. We need to stop before we go too far." "Do you really want to stop?" he asked, stepping closer. His voice was deep, and I could feel my internal barriers starting to crumble. I knew what I needed to say, that I needed to say yes, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I stepped forward and, without thinking about the consequences, pulled him close and kissed him again. This kiss was different, more insistent, deeper, and it carried all the passion I had been suppressing for so long. His arms wrapped around me, and I felt everything inside me tearing apart with desire. When we finally pulled away from each other, I noticed that his breathing was as unsteady as mine. We both knew there was no turning back. "Meredith," he began, but I interrupted him again. "No words right now. Let's just allow ourselves to be who we are," I said. And taking his hand, I led him back to the car. We drove in silence, but it was a silence filled with anticipation. When we returned home, I headed straight to my room, knowing that this night would be a long one. But despite everything, I felt more alive than I had in a long time. When Lewis announced that he was leaving for a week-long business trip, I felt a rush of mixed emotions. On one hand, it was familiar. His job often required travel, and I had grown accustomed to his absences. But this time was different. Now, with only Blake and me left in the house, I knew this week would become something more for both of us than just a temporary seclusion. As soon as Lewis's car disappeared around the corner, I realized I felt neither anxiety nor fear. Instead, there was a sense of freedom, the opportunity to finally be myself without hiding my feelings. Blake, standing nearby, seemed to feel this moment too. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same impatience that I felt within myself. We no longer tried to keep our distance or avoid each other. On the contrary, now that Lewis was gone, everything had changed. It was as if invisible chains had fallen away, and we could now savor every moment that was just for the two of us. This house, once seeming so empty and quiet, had now become our little world, where there was no place for prohibitions and limitations. On the very first evening after Lewis left, the atmosphere between us shifted. I was preparing dinner, and Blake sat in the kitchen, watching me. There was a mix of tenderness and passion in his gaze, and I felt his presence filling the space around me with a special electric tension. "Meredith," he began, stepping closer. His voice was soft, but there was a note of certainty in it. "Now that we're alone, I want to be honest. I can't pretend anymore that there's nothing between us." I turned to him, feeling my heart start to beat faster. "I can't either," I replied, not breaking eye contact. There were too many unspoken words between us. And now, finally, the moment had come when we could allow ourselves everything. Blake moved closer, and without waiting for me to say anything more, his arms wrapped around me, and I felt his lips touch mine. This kiss was filled with the passion we had accumulated over all those days of restraint. Now, there was no need for self-control. We could enjoy each other without thinking about the consequences. After dinner, we stayed on the terrace, enjoying the warm evening air. Blake sat beside me, his hand gently holding mine, and I felt a sense of calm and, at the same time, a sharp desire filling me. "How long are we going to hide?" he asked, his voice full of hope and passion. I looked at him, knowing that the answer to that question wasn't simple. But in that moment, with Lewis far away and us alone, it didn't matter. We could allow ourselves to live in the moment, enjoying each other without worrying about the future. "Let's just be here and now," I said, and in my words was all the freedom we had finally found. That night, we no longer hid from our feelings. Blake embraced me, and I felt his hands exploring every curve of my body with tenderness and passion. We allowed ourselves to be who we had always wanted to be. Every kiss, Every touch was filled with deep emotions that I had kept hidden for so long. Morning crept into the room quietly and cautiously, like a gentle breeze barely touching the curtains. The first rays of the sun slipped across the bed, filling the bedroom with a soft light. I was asleep, lulled by the night's calm, and didn't hear the door to my bedroom quietly open. Blake stood at the threshold, watching me. His gaze held that mix of tenderness and passion that drew me to him so intensely. He slowly approached the bed, careful not to disturb the silence, but with each step, his desire became more apparent. He knew this moment was inevitable, and now, as the morning concealed the shadows of the past, he felt that their time had come. As he leaned over me, I was still asleep, my face relaxed, my hair splayed across the pillow. Blake slowly ran his hand along my cheek, his touch barely perceptible, as if he was afraid to disrupt my sleep. But I felt that tender gesture, and, without waking, slightly turned towards him. My skin instantly responded to his touch, and Blake felt his heart begin to beat faster. He could no longer wait. Leaning closer, he softly kissed me on the lips, at first cautiously, as if testing whether I would wake. But I didn't open my eyes, and that emboldened him. His kiss deepened, grew more insistent, and finally, I began to wake up. I felt the warmth of his lips, and slowly opening my eyes, I saw him before me. In those first moments, I was bewildered, but then that same feeling I had tried to suppress exploded within me. Blake looked at me, his eyes filled with desire and determination, and I knew that resisting was now futile. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice low and husky, as if he himself couldn't believe what was happening. "Good morning," I replied, my lips barely parting before he kissed me again, this time with more passion. I felt his arms envelop me, pulling me closer. His warmth penetrated me, and I could no longer hold back. I responded to his kiss, pressing myself against him, feeling as if everything inside me was igniting. His hands were everywhere, exploring every inch of my body, with a tenderness and hunger I had never experienced before. I felt my fingers dig into his hair, my breathing quicken, and all my thoughts dissolve in this moment. Blake gently lifted me, his movements confident and full of passion. He lay down beside me on the bed, not breaking away from my lips, his hands slowly beginning to glide down, along my neck, across my shoulders, as if he wanted to memorize every curve of my body. I felt his fingers removing my clothing, each touch like an electric shock coursing through me. We were caught up in this moment, in our desires, and the passion we could no longer hide. He looked at me, his gaze full of fire, and I knew that this was the moment we had both been waiting for. I felt my body respond to his touch, my thoughts growing foggy with desire. Blake leaned down, his lips slowly moving down my neck, causing me to arch towards him, and I felt my body begin to tremble. I could no longer suppress the moan that escaped my lips. This moment was filled with a desire we could not ignore. Finally, he lifted his head and looked at me, his breathing uneven, his eyes glowing with passion. "Meredith," he whispered, his voice full of the emotions that overwhelmed us both. This moment was like an explosion. I felt his body merge with mine, and all my thoughts, all my doubts, evaporated. Blake moved slowly, his movements full of tenderness, and at the same time, passion. We were one, and this moment was ours alone. Our bodies moved in unison. Each of his thrusts was like a wave of pleasure that washed over me with renewed force. I could no longer think, could no longer hold back, only feel. Blake felt the same, and each of his breaths, each moan echoed my own desire. When it was over, I lay next to him, our bodies still trembling from the experience. I looked at him, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of my own feelings, happiness, satisfaction, and the realization that we could no longer deny what had happened. "I can't be without you anymore," he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Neither can I," I replied, and in that moment, I knew our world had changed forever. Now that we were together, I couldn't imagine going back to the life I had before this morning. A couple of days had passed since that morning when Blake and I stopped holding back and let our feelings take control. Those days were filled with passion, tenderness, and a sense of complete freedom that we allowed ourselves to savor. The house, which once seemed so quiet and empty, was now filled with our laughter, conversations, and endless touches. We enjoyed every moment, as if we knew it couldn't last forever. On the morning of the third day, when I woke up, the sun was already high above the horizon. I went down to the kitchen, where Blake was already waiting for me with a cup of coffee and his usual smile. He approached me, hugged me from behind, and kissed my neck, his lips leaving trails of warmth on my skin. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to sink into the moment, feeling his breath on my skin, savoring the closeness we now shared. "We still have a few more days," he whispered, his voice soft but filled with the joy of us being together. I smiled, leaning back against him, feeling his arms wrap around me. "And each one will be special," I replied, and in those words was all my certainty that this happiness was well-deserved, even if it was so forbidden. We spent the morning together, aimlessly wandering around the house, talking about trivial things, but in every conversation, there was this lightness and closeness that I had been searching for so long. Blake was attentive, his glances, his gestures, all spoke of how much he valued every moment spent with me, and I reciprocated in kind. After lunch, we settled on the couch in the living room. Blake turned on an old movie, but neither of us paid much attention to it. He pulled me closer, and I rested my head on his shoulder, feeling his arm wrap around me. Inside, everything sang with happiness, and I was certain that nothing could ruin this moment. Blake leaned in towards me, his lips once again finding mine, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. We kissed, our bodies merging into one, and I knew that this kiss was a promise we had made to each other. But in the next moment, I heard a sound that instantly made me freeze. The door. It had closed, and I felt everything inside me turn cold. We both pulled away from each other and turned toward the door, through which Lewis had just entered. He stood in the doorway, his suitcase still in hand, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief. At first, he couldn't comprehend what was happening, but then his gaze shifted to us, to the way Blake still held me in his arms, to our lips that had just been together. "What's going on here?" Lewis finally said, his voice full of disbelief and shock. His eyes darted between us, as if he was trying to make sense of what was unfolding before him, but the truth was already obvious. I felt panic rising inside me. The entire world that Blake and I had built over these few days collapsed in an instant. I saw the way Lewis looked at us and knew that no explanation, no words could undo what had already happened. "Lewis, I began, but the words got stuck in my throat. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to justify myself to him. In that moment, I saw the pain, the betrayal, and the anger reflected in his eyes. Blake slowly let go of me, his face pale, and he too didn't know what to say. This moment was inevitable, but we could never have prepared for it. "How could you?" Lewis dropped his suitcase on the floor, his voice trembling with the emotions that overwhelmed him. "How could you, Meredith? And you, Blake, my own nephew?" I saw how his face twisted with pain. All these years that we had been together, all the trust and love he had given me, were now shattered. And I knew there was no going back. "Lewis, forgive me," I whispered, and in those words was all my guilt that I now fully realized, but he no longer heard me. His gaze told me that something inside him had also broken. "Forgive?" he repeated, his voice sounding hollow. "Do you think that a simple apology can make everything right?" Blake took a step forward, but Lewis raised his hand, stopping him. "Don't come near me," he said, and there was a steely note in his voice that made us both freeze. At that moment, I understood that our lives, our family, would never be the same. Everything that had been built over the years was destroyed in a single instant. I looked at Blake, and in his eyes, I saw the same pain and realization. We couldn't justify ourselves, couldn't change what had already happened. Lewis stood before us, his eyes darting between Blake and me. It seemed as though he couldn't believe what was happening right in front of him, but his face reflected a firm resolve. He was no longer the man I knew. Pain and betrayal had changed him in an instant. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and detached. His words were like a blow that knocked the ground out from under me. I felt my heart clench with dread, but I couldn't say anything. Lewis no longer looked at us as his family. His eyes expressed only anger and disappointment. "Lewis, wait, let's talk," I began, but he cut me off with a gesture that silenced me. "No, Meredith, there's nothing left to talk about." His voice was laced with pain, but also determination. "You both betrayed me. I don't want to see you anymore. Pack your things and leave." Blake took a step forward, but stopped, seeing that Lewis wasn't going to relent. "Uncle, I'm sorry," he said, but there was none of the confidence in his voice that had been there before. "Sorry?" Lewis scoffed, and his laugh was full of bitterness. "Is that all you can say? You've destroyed my family, and now you're sorry?" I stood beside him, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. Everything I had tried to build with Blake was now crumbling right in front of me. I looked at Lewis, realizing that no words could heal his pain, and that our time in this house had come to an end. We silently went upstairs to pack our things. I could feel Blake walking beside me, but the closeness we once shared was already gone. Everything felt surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. When we came back down, Lewis stood by the door, his face grim but his gaze resolute. He no longer saw in me the woman he once loved, and at that moment, I understood that I had lost not only the house, but also the life we had built together. We stepped out of the house, and Lewis closed the door behind us. The sound severed us from the past, and now we stood on the brink of the unknown, unsure of what would come next. The air outside was cool, and I felt a shiver run through me. Blake stood next to me, but his gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance. I looked at him, trying to understand what he was feeling, but his face was unreadable. "Blake," I began quietly, not knowing how to express what was tearing me apart inside. "What do we do now?" He looked at me, his eyes full of sadness, but there was none of the fire in them that I had seen before. "Meredith, I'm not sure that anything serious can happen between us." His words hit me like a punch, almost knocking the wind out of me. "What are you saying?" I whispered, not believing my ears. "We made a mistake," he continued, avoiding my gaze. "I don't think I can continue our relationship after what's happened." I felt my world collapsing all over again. What I thought was the beginning of a new life turned out to be just an illusion. "But you said you couldn't live without me." My words were full of desperation, but he shook his head. "I thought I could, but now I see it was wrong. We both made a mistake, and I don't want to make it worse." I looked at him, unable to comprehend how this could be happening. Just a few days ago, we were so close, but now I was standing before a man who was ready to leave me. Tears began to stream down my cheeks, and I felt everything inside me breaking apart. "But I love you," I whispered, hoping those words would change something. He shook his head again, and in his eyes, I saw the pain he couldn't express in words. "Meredith, I feel something for you too, but it's not something that can continue. We need to stop before it gets even worse." I couldn't believe his words, but something inside me told me he was right. I stood there, feeling the cold seep through my clothes, realizing that I no longer had a place to go. I was alone, left without a home, without a husband, and now without the one who I thought would replace all of that. Blake slowly moved away from me, his steps heavy as if each one echoed in his heart. "Goodbye, Meredith," he said before turning and walking away, leaving me standing alone in the cold, with the wind cutting through everything that was left of my hopes. I walked down the street, not knowing where I was headed. My legs carried me forward, but my mind was in turmoil. Everything that had been a part of my life had crumbled in a single moment. The home I once considered my refuge was now closed to me. The husband I had entrusted my life to had thrown me out, and Blake, who had become a symbol of passion and hope for me, had left me in solitude. Everything I had thought was real had turned out to be an illusion, shattered in an instant. I stopped at the corner of the street, unsure of where to go next. The cold wind cut through me, and I felt my body stiffen from the chill, but it was nothing compared to the icy terror that gripped my heart. The world around me seemed empty and gray, devoid of the colors I once saw. Everything had lost its meaning. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I couldn't stop them. I tried to understand how I had come to this. How could I have made such a mistake, losing everything that mattered? I recalled those moments of passion with Blake, those feelings that had seemed so real, and realized that now they were just ghosts of the past that I couldn't bring back. I found a secluded spot in a small park and sat on a bench, wrapping my arms around myself as if trying to ward off the cold that had invaded my heart. Images from the past flashed before my eyes. My home, Lewis, his smile, our life before everything went wrong. I thought about how we had loved each other, how we had built our family. But now, all of that seemed distant, as if it wasn't my life but someone else's dream that had long since ended. The world I had so carefully built now lay in ruins, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. Every breath was a struggle, and inside me, a void was growing, expanding with each passing moment. I understood that I had made mistakes that couldn't be undone, and now I was alone, facing the consequences of my actions. The pain of loss was unbearable. I had lost not only Lewis, but also myself, the woman who had once been confident, who had believed in love and the future. Now I was just a shadow, lost in this cold world where there was no longer a place I could call home. I thought about Blake, about his words that nothing serious could happen between us. In that moment, I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. I had believed that he could be my salvation, but now I understood that it had been merely a desire to escape from a reality I couldn't accept. He wasn't the one who could fill the emptiness inside me. He had been just a flash, bright but brief, leaving me in even greater darkness. Sitting on the bench, I felt time slow down. Life went on around me, people passed by, but it all seemed foreign and distant. I was alone in this world that no longer belonged to me, and in that solitude, I realized that I faced a long and difficult journey, a road full of regrets and losses. I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive myself for what had happened, but I knew one thing. I had to find the strength to keep living, even if the world was no longer as I knew it. It took several hours before I could stand up and move on. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. This day had changed everything, and I had to find a way to live with it, no matter how hard it would be. I took the first step, and despite all the pain that tore at me, I knew that it was a step toward a new life, no matter how difficult it might be.